My name is Paul Milan. I'm here to tell you about the Milan family and how they became refugees and ended up in the United States. They were from the Valencia area of Spain, and my grandfather and his brother and one of his cousins were planning to go to the Philippines. As they were going, they were getting work done in the Philippines. One of my uncles or aunts got sick, so the brother-in-law, that's what he was, the brother-in-law, Soriano, went to the Philippines. And while they were waiting, they were on their way to the Philippines, planning on it when they got this offer to go to Mexico. And it was by the Madero family, he was a future president of Mexico, had recruited him and his brother to come to Mexico to work. And he had a number of haciendas in Mexico. He was very wealthy, had mining, and they had expertise in the grape farming, and so they had farm work. And so they decided they liked the deal in Mexico better than the Philippines, so they came to Mexico. They were placed in an hacienda in Piedras Negras, which is right off the border of Texas, and he had a huge hacienda there. And I understand they actually employed like 3,000 people to work the farms there. And he and his brother were in charge of it. And they had a 7-year contract. They're planning to go back in 7 years. After 7 years, it was renewed and for another 7 years. During that time, when they left Spain, they had originally 5 children. One had died. So they brought 4 children from Spain into Mexico. While they were in Mexico, they had 5 more children, and one of them died. And when Mr. Madero became president in the Mexican history, the revolution came and he was assassinated. But right before then, and for some reason I'm not sure of, they had acquired either a hotel or rented a hotel. They moved to a hotel in Piedras Negras when the president was assassinated, and they were running that hotel. And then they started a campaign of expelling all foreigners from Mexico. And they came to him, and the story I heard is that they rounded them up and they started walking he called the bandits. They were to the revolution. First thing they did, my aunt was telling me this, they came and took his horse away. He didn't want to give it up, but the girl said, give him the horse, give him the horse. They said, then they want to take his shoes. And he kind of fought him about that, and a little bit, and the girl started saying, you know, the shoes are not worth it for your life. Let's get out of here. So they became to the United States as refugees, and they were placed into a camp, a refugee camp, close to what I understand, close to Piedras Negras across the border. And that's my father was 3 years old at the time, and he remembers the barracks, and he remembers it well because one day my grandfather went out and got a hold of a bunch of bananas, and my father took a bunch of them, went under the barracks and ate them. He stuffed himself till he swelled up, and he couldn't get out of the barracks, so they had to tear the floor out to get him out. And that was the thing that he remembered the most. He said the only thing he remembered in Mexico, and he liked to tell it, is he was outside the hotel and all of a sudden this pig was running with with a dagger in its back, and these Chinese were running after it. And he said, that's the only thing I remember about Mexico. And the other thing was the only thing he remembered about the barracks. Well, they had, as they were trying to figure how to get enough money to go back to Spain, because they still had their property in Spain, recruiters from the coal companies in Gallup came around and said, if you would become a coal miner, we'll get you visas to stay here. And there was my uncle, he was around 14 or 15 years old. You had to be 21 to work in the mines. He faked he was a very mature young man, that man. He was very mature, and he passed, he said he was 21, and my grandfather was 21, and then they had all these girls, and my father was a baby. So they decided, we're going to go to work the coal mines, get enough money to go back to Spain. So they ended up at the coal mine in Gallup, was called Navajo coal mine. And one of my aunts got a job in the commissary, and they made a deal to take over the men's dormitory and run it. So the girls had a job there. My grandmother ran the deal. And my father and his older sister, she was 2 or 3 years older than him, they were in charge of the bathhouse. When the miners would come, they'd heat it up, and so they were refugees, and we talked about refugees now. The first thing they started doing is learning English. And the camp was, everybody in the camp were foreigners. There were very few Spaniards, but there were some. In fact, my uncle met a coal miner that was from Spain. He had been a coal miner since he was 12 years old. And they worked out a deal instead of to become contractors instead of employees, because they make more money that way. That way they got up early in the morning and worked all day, came home, ate, went back and worked till 9 o'clock at night. And that's how they started making money. They didn't find out that my uncle was under 21 until the World War I came, and everybody over 21 was brought, had to go to the army. And so after all those years that he worked coal mine, which was about 7 years, they fired him. But then they had saved their money. My grandmother had a pillowcase, and they bring all the money to her, and she would pay all the bills, and the rest went in that pillowcase. And so he had a thought of opening a store in Gallup, and so he opened what's called the People's Market. People's Market is downtown Gallup, and he had a vision that he could get all the coal miners to come and if he specialized in foods from all the different countries. And his big deal was a meat market, and he got meat that all the different nationalities liked, and it expanded even to the point where he put a meat market downtown Dallas for the creme de bases for the elite, got special meats for them. And he bought the first couple of trucks, refrigerated trucks, and he would haul meat over to the railroad camps and outside the camps around Gallup. And he did very well with the meat market. They were doing well. He built a lot of houses and rented them to miners. A lot of miners didn't mind working at the mining camp, but they wanted their kids to go to school downtown. So he started building houses and renting them to them, and doing very well. Finally, he married, and the marriage didn't last, so he was divorced. He wasn't divorced, like that. My grandmother would not allow him to get a divorce, but they were separated when he got killed. He was out collecting bills the day before Thanksgiving, and he went out and was killed by these three people. Three people. They were from Mexico, and he lived long enough to be able to identify, because he had argued with one about a bill years before, so he knew who they were. And but he didn't live. The next day he died. You had, I said, there was four girls from Spain and 4 from Mexico, and then there was one born in the United States, and she died, and there was one born in Mexico that died, and there was one born in Spain that died. So they all stayed in Gallup. They grew up in Gallup, became very popular in Gallup because they were beautiful girls. I should say so myself. And if you look at the history of it, they were refugees, and they all married refugees. The oldest one married a Spaniard, a Catalan, which is different from a Valenciano. It's like 2 different countries in Spain. And he was a baker. He had family in Mexico that recruited him to come, and had a big bakery in Mexico. So he learned the bakery business. And when he was sent out as refugees, they had to walk from Mexico City all the way to the border. And he said half the people that they walked died on the way from the heat and starvation. Well, he made it, started his bakery, and married my aunt, and the next daughter married a Spaniard who was the miner. That she married the first Spaniard she married. Had a son, and he didn't work out and ran off. And then she married the second one, who was a Spaniard, and he raised the son and had 4 more kids. But the son that was from the first didn't know he was a stepson until he was drafted into the service. And like I say, the oldest one married the Spaniards. They had 2 children. One became a doctor in Dallas. He'd gone to Dallas to school over there, and ended up staying in Dallas. And then the third one married a German immigrant, and they moved to Seattle, to that area, and then finally Los Angeles area. And the next daughter married a Spaniard from the northern Spain. He was down there, and they ended up going to California. And the youngest 2, which was my father, married an American citizen whose family were refugees in the early 1800s. And my aunt, everybody knew my Aunt Mary, Villa de Cabero. She married Wally Gunn, who was half Laguna and half Scottish, from Scottish immigrants. And that became our family, and it became a very large family with all the children. Most of them ended up going to California. And my father married Veneranda Mirabal from San Rafael, whose family were refugees. Well, they came in the early 1800s to New Mexico from Spain. As a byline of what we were talking about, the Milan family, I had mentioned that my grandfather and his brother-in-law, whose last name was the Sorianos, were planning to go to the Philippines. Well, one of the kids got sick, and so the Soriano, he went on to the Philippines. Meanwhile, as I mentioned before, they got an opportunity to go to Mexico, so they went to the Philippines. I want to tell you what happened with that family. They took the Philippines and became one of the wealthiest family in the area. And they talk about the whole area like that. They owned what was called San Miguel beer thing. One thing I wanted to mention, because I had mentioned my grandmother's family, his name was, last name was Soriano, and they were, as I had mentioned before, they were all planning to go to the Philippines. And one of my uncles or aunts got sick, and so the brother-in-law went to the Philippines on his own, and they were going to go later. And then this opportunity came to go to Mexico. They decided to take that. Well, the Sorianos went on to become one of the wealthiest families in the Philippines. And it was just amazing. Their main product was the San Miguel beer brewery. And as time went on, you know, I heard about them. Once I went to a bank conference, and a gentleman called me and he said, I'm a banker from the Philippines, and I have to go to a meeting, and my wife doesn't speak English. Does your wife speak Spanish? Because we speak Spanish. And I said, yes. And I said, oh, by the way, I said, I've got family in the Philippines, the Sorianos. He said, well, they own our bank. So they went on and found out they were in mining. They owned an airline. They were quite wealthy. And we never made contact with him. My father found out that he was his counterpart was in a hospital in New York, and so he called over there so you could make contact with him. And they said, well, he got discharged yesterday. But usually when they went to the States, they were in the financial pages like that. But the funniest thing about it is that when I went to college, one of my companions was from the Philippines, and I had gone to work on my master's, and I had the 4 kids, and we got to know each other quite well, and I never really brought that up with him. But when we were getting ready to graduate, he told me, would you consider going to the Philippines? And I said, I don't know. He says, because I think you could do good in the Philippines. And I said, well, I would have to sit down with my wife, and I got 3 kids that one's a baby, but the other one's talk about doing that. And he said, no, you'd have to just leave them, divorce them. He says, because I can find a very rich family that would love to have grandchildren that look like you. And I said, that's the first time I ever heard that in my life. And but another thing, my son Pablo was in Japan at the service, and he got very sick, and they sent him to the Philippines to get out because it was raining all the time in Japan, and it was causing him all this problems with his arms and body, and so they sent him over there, and he decided to go see if he could find the Sorianos. He went to this big building, and he went through a lot of this and that, and trying to get in there, and he said, I'm related to the Sorianos, and I'd like to meet them. And they said, we could tell by the way you look that you're related to the Sorianos, but he said they're not here right now. They're out of pocket. He says, but the way you look, you wouldn't have gotten this far if you hadn't looked like you look. So he told him. So I thought that was kind of funny, but we never made the contact. And the last we heard, Marcos had taken 51% of the brewery away from him. So I guess his wife could buy the shoes that she was buying. Remember all the shoes she owned, and he was in New York arranging to buy it back from him. And when we went to Spain once, we were visiting a lot of the Soriano family. We made contact with them, and they took us to all the different houses. They even tried to find the Milans, we couldn't find it. But as we were passing there was a new site. There was a building they were building of San Miguel beer from the Philippines. And I said, you know, that's your relative. And they said, we don't even know about that. We don't know nothing about him. But anyway, that's just a side story. So we include my grandmother's brother. All the families that I knew, Milans and Sorianos, they were all towards business. And so it wasn't, when my family, the Milans, went to Gallup, of course they worked in the coal mines, but as time went on in the coal mines, my grandfather, of course, he did not like the coal mines. So what he did is he started buying milk cows, and the girls would get up in the morning and milk the cows, and my father and his little sister, who was like that, they would deliver milk before they went to school. And in fact, he got where he liked it very much, that he bought 40 acres out of Albuquerque, and he was going to do eventually a dairy over there. But when my uncle was let go at the coal mines because of his age, they didn't find out he was under 21 until they were drafting for the First World War. And so he went on, and his dream was to start a store, so that was the time to start it. So they developed People's Market. It was a mostly meat market, but of course they had all kinds of groceries. But they catered to all the different ethnic groups in Gallup, and they would buy stock for the different groups out of California. They imported a lot from Mexico because there was you had mentioned Chihuahua. There was a lot of Mexican miners, stuff like that. Unfortunately, there was only about 3 Spanish families, which I got to know and grew up in some marriage within it. And he worked and became very, very successful in business, expanding to building houses and running to the miners that he knew. And I mean, it was amazing. I have some of the old deeds and things that he owned. Of course, when he died, his wife they had to pay her for half of the business. She took all the rentals, and it was like him gone and them starting over. The unfortunate thing is that my aunt, who had worked all the time, an older aunt, she married a Slav by name of Grinko, and they had the one son, and by the time they got organized, he came home, laid on the sofa and died, started bleeding internally. And she was running the store, and she was trying to keep up with things. The unfortunate thing is she started lending money to the Grinko coal mining company, and they went broke, and it almost broke them. And my father took over the store, and which he had grown up in, so it wasn't like he didn't know what to do. But she had leased or rented the part of the store to this Italian bootlegger, and so she told my father, she said, well, I'm going to marry Barney Oriole, and you take over. So that was his introduction to being the owner of a business that was going broke right during the middle of the Depression. He made a deal with, the thing that he had a choice that time. Safeway wanted to hire him to run their meat department. They offered him a salary that he never got before. He got 2 Sundays off a month, which he never had before. He said it was very hard with a child to make a decision, but he didn't want the family name to be involved in the bankruptcy. So he went into an agreement where he paid them $100 a week, which is during the Depression was like $1,000 a week now, and he had to pay cash for all everything he bought, all the stock he bought. So that made him go around looking, since he had to pay cash, for bargains, and he found that he could buy a lot of Chilean Laguna for almost, would you believe, 10 cents a. So he got to know the area pretty well. Got to know the owner of the Yucca Hotel, George Ade. I think George Ade, my records show George Ade was the first mayor, but he was the unofficial mayor at 1930 when they became a town. But before that, he was the unofficial mayor. Evidently, he had a wonderful personality. He owned the Lux Hotel and the Yucca Hotel. They went to have dinner at Mother Whiteside's restaurant, and my mother was there during her lunch break. She was going to the high school, and he introduced my father to my mother, and they got to talking, and he kind of knew where she was. So the next Sunday he drove over there to see her, and got to her house and came and said, I came to see you and meet your father. Something like that. I said, well, I'm sorry, but I got a date, but you can talk to my father. And so they had a good afternoon, and my grandfather said, why don't you come next Sunday? I enjoyed talking to you. If you ever met my father, he was very, very eloquent. And so he came the next Sunday, and my mother said, gee, they were having so much fun talking over there, I think I'd rather join them than go out. And so that's how they started. And he started coming to the dances. And this was hard because he had to, Friday night, he cut meat all night, so that they have enough for Saturday and Sunday. And on Saturday, he'd leave the store about 3 or 4 o'clock, drive to San Rafael, pick up my mother, go to Gallup, have dinner with my grandmother, go to a movie or a dance. Then he would drive her back to San Rafael, then go back, and he'd get at his the house. And my grandmother they used to have a 5 o'clock mass in the morning, a.m., and he'd get there, and she'd be there, take me to mass. He said, I slept in front of that church every Sunday for quite a while, and but that's the way they got started. And you have to understand it was not a paved road, and if you know my father, he drove as fast as a car could go. And he liked cars. He liked to race them. He had an old Hudson at that time, and he was. My grandfather used to ride with him, but he would ride with one foot with the door open in case he had to jump because he was scared of the way he drove. And my grandfather was used to wagons. That was pretty fast for him. Anyway, they started their courtship, and they decided to get, after she graduated, and in fact she always talks, she says, they were having a graduation and they were having a reception. He was going to come to the reception at the Yucca Hotel, and he didn't show up. So she went out in front of the house there and caught a ride to the thing, waiting, and didn't wait for him there. And he finally showed up, and that's when he proposed to her, and they got married. It was in May, and they got married in June. And that started, she moved to Gallup, and they lived in a little apartment next to the store. It was actually attached to the store. And that's where I grew up for my first 8 years. But my mother couldn't cook. She could make candy. My aunts were all fabulous cooks, according to my grandmother. In fact, three of the sisters-in-law ended up having restaurants. And but my mother, there was something about her she learned, and she even surpassed them in cooking. She not only made New Mexico food, she learned to make all the Spanish food. She made all the kinds of cakes you could believe in, and Christmas, of course, you know, during the war there was you couldn't get sugar without stamps. People would come to we were living at the ranch, so they'd come and bring her their sugar, make me some candy, and by the time Christmas came, the whole house was just laid out with candy, all kinds of candy. She learned, but she learned to be a rancher's life. My father learned to be a rancher. In 1939, my grandfather died, and the estate was huge, and there was a lot of heirs, and so that took time to split it all up. They had to get everything appraised, and then each person had to bid on what part of it they wanted. Nobody really wanted this part because they were all sheep herders, sheep and cattle. They wanted most of the ranges. And my father said, I wanted this area, told my mother, because if I can't do, because the land went all the way to Grants. In fact, my grandfather's land surrounded Grants, all come from Santa Fe. And Grants, so he said, that way, if I can't make it in this, if I'm in Grants, I can put a store over there. That's what I know how to do. And but he read a lot. He got a lot of books on ranching, and tried everything you could think of at the ranch. And moving from Gallup to the ranch, the only thing that inspired me was the horses. But I really didn't want to leave Gallup at the time because I had so many friends there. And you go from that many friends and then to an isolated place, just me and my brother, and my mother and father. My sister, my mother wouldn't bring her to the ranch during the school year because number one, it was cold. We didn't have indoor plumbing, and she didn't want my sister to like that. So she made arrangements with my grandmother and my aunt that lived there to take care of her during the winter, and then she came in the summer when it was nice. And so we all grew up in the ranch, and we experienced. My father decided that he would just specialize in sheep, and he sold the cattle that he got. He sold it, and just did the ranching. And he started. This area had been overgrazed because my grandfather had built right across where the country club was. He had built a shearing plant there, and they would shear. They could shear 70,000 sheep in 6 weeks, And so all the sheep that would come in there, they just completely ruined the whole area. So my father didn't graze any sheep on it. He started developing, trying to get it back into hopefully grazing. And as time went on, the carrots came, and he watched as they grew. And he was eligible for blue water, so he decided he was going to use that to make permanent pastures, because he found out that you can get heavier sheep on a permanent pasture. You can the chances for having twins were greater because you weren't moving them around, and he thought that would be his deal. So that's what he started doing. Started grazing alfalfa and developing area for permanent pastures. The unfortunate thing is that as the carrots were growing, they didn't have enough water in blue water. And then in 40, I was going to say 44, 45, 46, it was really had a drought in the area, and they had no water. And that's when my father and Mr. Carr started talking, and they decided, let's joint venture and drill a well. They talked to engineers, and the engineer said, finding a well in that area is almost impossible because you have streams, and you have to be able to locate a stream to get any kind of water, and it wouldn't be that much. I mean, it's good you had windmills. We had 4 windmills, but in different areas. And Grants, that was pretty well known that they were streams that they were tapping for their water in Grants. So they hired, the engineers told them it would be a bad deal. So they hired a water witch. And we had a willow tree in our yard, and he came over there and cut a twig off and fixed it up, and I followed him around as he was going. And he went down. So right here, there was a drilling company by the name of Turner Brothers. They came and drilled a well. They hit water at 80 feet, and that saved the carrot business. Within 2 or 3 years, there was 20 wells in the valley. So the water from the lake was used. My father was the president of the water association, Blue Water Association, and he found out that the state was interested in making it a lake for people to use, and they agreed to buy 30 feet of water. They could go down to 30 feet, and pay them $400,000 to pay off the bonds that they had done to use. So they were debt free, and they were using water wells more for everything like that. As time went on, he first got into beans, and he was given a name, and young Japanese that could raise it. He came and he raised the beans, and stayed for a year, showed my father how to do it, and then he went back to California, and my father took over then. He liked it because the beans were subsidized by the government at a pretty good price, and they bought all the beans. And but as time went on, they kept lowering the price, and finally he decided that he would. There was a lot of different setups coming in with the farmers as the carrots grew. They built the sheds, as you know that, and he went on to make deals with Stanley Card, and they would come and make a deal and farm on his land. He'd furnish the land and the water. they would do the farming and harvesting, and they'd split the profits. And he had those kind of things. And then one day, the Japanese, you know, during the war, they brought 3 Japanese families here because the gentleman by the name of Captain Reed, who was a railroad, he was an attorney. He had a lot of influence, and he knew a lot of farmers, and he knew a lot of people who worked for the railroad, and he knew a lot of people in Washington. He got them brought in, rather put him, instead of putting him in the camp, some of his friends that he knew, one from California, one from family, 2 families from California, one from Denver, brought him in here, and they hooked up with the farmers and did farming here. Well, one of them, by the name of S. Lee, he never told you what his name was. It was S. Lee. He came to my father. He had heavy equipment, and that's what he was doing. He said to my father, he says, I learned to farm from the farmers, from the Tagamis and Yonemotos. And he said, you got the land, let's make a deal. And I got the equipment. And so grew the Milan and Lee farms started. And, they became very, very successful. And then Mr. Lee died in 1953. And my father learned from him. And Mr. Lee kept notes. He just followed his notes on where to go and what to do. And so he learned the carrot business. First he learned to market them. And one of his thing was they had the refrigerated trucks started coming in because they used to use the ice and everything was railroad. You sent it to Chicago and they went on the well, with refrigerated trucks, they had access to many markets, and they were sending to Georgia quite a bit, and they'd talk to them on the phone, and he says, Milan and Lee, well, you know, there was Milan, and then there was Lee, and they said it's a pleasure to do business with Southerners like you. I told my father. And my father says, I didn't tell him anything, but he told Mr. Lee, he said, if they only knew they were dealing with a Mexican and a Jap. They was like that, but he got into the carrot business and was very successful. He learned it very fast. I got to work with him. I was going to college then, but I used to work in the summertime. I learned quite a bit. In the summertime, I worked for the for one of the other farms, and so I learned quite a bit then. So when Mr. Lee died, I started working. It's funny, I was supposed to work with Mr. Lee. I worked for him for a week, and all he did was take me in his pickup and show me and talk to him. Finally we sat down and I said, are you sure there isn't something you want me to do here? And he said, well, I have to tell you, in my country, your father and I are on the same level. I can't tell you what to do. I can't. So that's when I got a job with the Ralph Card and worked with him. Mr. Lee died, and I came in the summertime and worked on the farm. And the last thing my father did was all of a sudden they were going to the cello bags, and what sold it, what got a premium from the Grant's carrot was the large tops, beautiful tops. The women just loved them, buy them. So they cut the tops off and they were putting them in bags. And the bad thing about it is that they used to cull quite a bit of the carrots, make sure they were all the same size, the same like that. Well, they would use orange bags, and you couldn't tell how good they were, how bad they were. But he built the last shed to use cellos. It's a Quonset hut by going to the airport. That was the last one that he built. And I came home for Easter, he took me to the country club, and we were talking there, and he says, I got an offer to sell the ranch. And he says, I can't, they're offering me $1,000 an acre, and it's worth $300 an acre as a farm. And I said, well, if I was you, that's what I'd do. If it was me, I wouldn't do it. That's the way it is, because it's pretty much spent my whole life there. So that's when he sold the ranch. And at that time, the uranium started developing, and it was the uranium companies that needed the water. That's why they actually sold the land, because they had to buy the land to get the water. And and as you can see, that thing has been just vacant all these years, the ranch. But he kept half of it, and that's when he started. There was a big demand. There's a big demand, especially along the highway here. That's what started. And he built his home here, and he moved. Before then, he moved the operation of the ranch here. He had built a motel previously, about 1947, and my mother and my brother and my sister and myself, we ran the motel. And then when I always said that I went to Albuquerque because I was in the band, and they were having a special thing that they sent me to. And while I was there, he rented a motel. So he stopped by when I was staying with my aunt, and he said, "Don't go home because there's not a home." He says, "I rented a house in Grants." He says, "I rented a motel." Well, basically, my father was with a few of the businessmen in town. They were tired of going to Albuquerque and Gallup to do their banking business. Although Mr. Gunnarsson did helped a lot of people cashing their checks at his store, and he had a big safe over there, and people would leave their bags of money for safekeeping. And they just felt there's got to be a bank, and so they all got together. There was about 10 of them got together, and my father was one of them. He was one of them that continued staying with the bank and growing with it until he became the chairman of the board. But he had been a board vice president for quite a while, and at that time there was some. The funny part of the story is that Mr. Gunnarsson, who was the chairman of the board, bank examiners came in and were checking out everything, and they noticed that Mr. Gunnarsson had businesses all over. You know, he had quite a few businesses in town, and probably about 8 or 10. And bank examiner said, "Well, I guess nobody can do business here or borrow money unless they do business with you." Just joking. And he said, "If that's what you think, I'm resigning." And so about that time is when my father became a board member and went on. But he liked it. My father liked challenges, if you want to say that. He was not afraid to get into anything. And if you look at the history that they've got, he's started with the People's Market in Gallup, and then the ranch here, and before you know it, he was involved in many things in the area, many businesses. And I was 13 when that bank started, and I had recovered from an accident, so I didn't get to go to the parade. They had a big parade. I didn't get to go to the picnic. They had a big picnic. I was in bed that time. But it was always, everybody was very proud to have a bank in town, their own bank. I didn't get interested as far as going to the bank. My interest became in the agriculture. and I worked on the farm here, and then I worked for Stanley Card, as I'd mentioned before, and my father and Mr. Lee started their farm, their carrot farm, and Mr. Lee died. I came and worked for my father during the summer, because I went to New Mexico State. It was then New Mexico A&M, Agriculture and Mechanical Engineering, and that became my future as far as I was concerned. At the time, the year I was graduating, I came home for Easter, and my father said I got a proposal to buy the land for the water rights from the uranium companies. He said it's too much to let go, so go. And I said, what am I going to do? And he said, well, you got your degree, you can do anything you want, you know. Anyway, I knew that I had to leave here if I was going to stay in agriculture, and I didn't want to leave at the time. And I enrolled in the law school in New Mexico, New Mexico here, and found out in one semester that I was not going to be a lawyer. That was not my deal. So I made a deal. My father mentioned, he said, why don't you come work in the bank? And I said, I just don't think I could do it. You know, it's not me. But I'll tell you what, I found a college in Mexico City. It's that I can learn. I'd like to go and really learn Spanish well. And they have a lot of business courses that I could take, which I was glad I did. He said, fine. I went to Mexico, enrolled in the college, and it wasn't a couple of weeks that I went to the Newman Club, and there was Hortensia, my future wife, and I liked her because she was one of the friendliest persons in the group, and I went with a Canadian boy, and he said, we're all going to this German pub after the thing and see if I can get you a ride. And everybody had cars that were full. And I said, don't worry, we'll take a cab. Cab was inexpensive. Just give us the address. And that started our courtship. And it was her mother got very sick and she stopped going to the Newman Club to take care of her mother. And I didn't know her telephone number, and I didn't know her address. So I said, this was over with, you know, and I just went on. I ran into her at one of the meetings after a long time, and at that time I got her telephone number, called her after, and we started dating. And that's where we got married. Came back here, I took the bank job, and spent 11 years. The bank, I had the dean of international business that I was with called me in one day and said Chase Manhattan's looking for somebody, and you're the only one of my students I think they would hire, and you got a good thing. You're an American. You speak good Spanish. You're gonna be married to a Mexican, and it just works real well. And he said, "What was your plan?" I said, "Well, I was going to go back to my hometown and work in the bank over there." And he said, "What's the chances of getting control of that bank?" And I said, "Sounds pretty good because I know the directors and none of them have children. If they do, they're not interested in something like that." He says, "If I were you, I'd go back home, go get a bank with a plan to take over that bank." He said, "You go work for a big bank and they'll spit you out anytime they feel like it." He says, "I worked for a bank for 10 years, and Bank of America is what he said, for 10 years. So I took his advice and came back home and worked it like that. the time came when we had a chance to take over the bank. My father and myself, and our lawyers, everybody said, well, you have to advertise it. You can advertise it in Grants, you can advertise it in Gallup, and you'll be the only ones that'll probably bid on it, because it's complicated. The people that had the bank, their loan came due and they couldn't pay it, and so we bought the loan, and we had to put it up for bid by law, and so we came in on that day, and unfortunately my dad's lawyer, he went and talked to him and see what we had to do. He was a director of one of the banks in Albuquerque, and he said, oh, there's a bank for sale in Grants, and it's going to be bidding like that. So one of the directors in his company came over and looked at it, and we got the feeling that he wasn't interested. But the day of the bidding, he walked in and bid way above our price. It would be like that. So they took it over, and they started bringing in their people, and it was just I was working too hard. They were all inexperienced, and I told my wife, I said, I can't deal with this anymore. I'm going to go back and get my master's in New Mexico, and in business. That way it'd be business, and take it from there. And that's what I did. And when I got out, it seemed like I knew all the bankers in New Mexico by that time, because I was involved in the associations, and they all said, give us a chance when you get back. We want you. When I got out and got my master's, there was a recession. The banks were letting people go, they weren't hiring. And that's just a thing like that. And I started applying different places, and I got a bite from federal government to go to Dallas. And so I took it, and I had went into their planning and evaluation group that they'd started, and then I went into intergovernmental after a couple of years, and worked that for about 10 years. I was in that, and I really enjoyed it. And then we got a new president, and they start cutting down, and they eliminated our deal. So I was out in the streets for a while, and then one of my friends in the government had an opening by chance, and I went back into another field. I really enjoyed working for the government. Then I came home one day and was told that the bank was been sold to another group. But FDIC wouldn't let them take control because they had a bad record in Texas. There were a group of Texas that had a bunch of savings and loans. So I said, let's put a group together and see if we can buy it. And I got some of the stockholders, and I was able to get a commitment from 21%, which gave us an opportunity to set up a community bank shares holding company, and then go after the bank. It took us 2 or 3 years because these people were very rich, in a sense that they borrowed a lot of money, and they used to go to they had some of the best lawyers in Houston, go up there with $1 million and say, just keep us out of trouble. And you should see, we started investigating, and you should see all the lists of things that they did. And what they would do is like in our deal, they would postpone, get us into court, postpone until we went broke. They did that with a bank up north, and then walk away with all the assets. Anyway, we finally got a hold of the bank, and I'd been I was eligible for retirement with the federal government, so I took my retirement, came back home, and this is where I was until now. They do, and actually that's the most interesting part. That's why I enjoy the Historical Society. It is beginning to, I've been digging up things and trying to put them down on paper, and it's strange because when I was younger I could care less about history. You know, it was there, but I've gotten to where I really enjoy reading about people's different, and I think the most interesting is their family histories. And we've got so much around here, it's unbelievable, you know. And I hope that the Historical Society will be able to do what we're doing now, you know, be able to interview people and have it, because if it isn't printed or isn't put in something, it'll be lost forever.